I was glad to step on land, but did not know what to expect. The company was spread out as we trudged along, but then we suddenly stopped. The word was passed back to our squad, headed by Sergeant Zingale, to move forward on the double. By the time we reached the head of the column, we were hot, sticky, sweaty, and very exhausted, and had not yet fired one shot in anger. We were ordered to join Battalion Sergeant Major Funk and Lieutenant Colonel Hill, who were studying some nearby huts and checking for movement. There were 6 native buildings used by the Japanese airmen as quarters and a native-built church. Since I was the bar man, I moved from my area into a clearing and covered the building with my gun. Hill threw 3 grenades at the nearest hut, the church. One went off with a weak explosion, the other 2 did not. After a short period of waiting, Hill carefully entered the church to check and found his grenades lying there. He picked them up and put their pins back in. The strikers were corroded to the frame. We were fighting in World War II with ammunition, rifles and machine guns produced in 1917. We were to land to the right of Halita with Company B on the left. The objective was to secure the village and join forces on Florida Island, thus blocking the escape route of the Japanese from Florida Island. There was one oversight in this plan. The mangrove swamp extended God knows how many miles in all directions and was impassable. The endeavour on Florida was described by another, an unidentified Marine. When we hit the beach, there were no Japanese. We had a Lewis gun set up in the bow of the landing craft and fired into the foliage as we were landing. Company A came through Company C's sector and moved forward. The platoon of Company D that had accompanied our runabout, the code name for Florida Island Expedition for Fire Support, was in the last position, protecting our rear. We went along our jungle trail. It was hotter than hell. We hit a small village and sought the enemy, but found none. We did locate a cache of aviation gasoline, but moved out to another village a short distance up the trail and found a second gasoline dump. That evening, 1C2 returned to the first village and spent the night. Guards were posted, and an additional Hells Islands guard, Perfiset Jack A. Mack, was stationed at the village well. It was thought Japanese might have poisoned it. There was rifle fire all night. Paul T. Boyd of Company A, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, remembered. We landed early on the 7th and moved as quickly as possible towards the seaplane landing. I think Company C had the point. The jungle was rough, and plenty of parrots were making all sorts of racket. As I recall, we moved as quietly as possible with a lot of hand signals and brief stops. At the village of Halavo, each company was assigned a sector and dug in for the night. There was a lot of shooting that night at trees and shadows. In the midst of a downpour, only like it can rain in the Solomons, we boarded a Higgins and took off for Tulagi to support the raiders. Bill Cannon also recalled, "A machine gun was firing all night, almost like a loud chainsaw, firing and firing at would-be invaders and never letting up until dawn." Major Woodby Kyle remembered, "We could not get them to stop firing." The first night on hostile shores was disorganized and full of dark and moving shadows. A Marine sergeant in Company D went out to relieve himself while his foxhole buddy was asleep, and upon returning he was shot 3 times by his foxhole companion. The shooter was so distraught that he had to be evacuated. The total casualties for D-Day on Florida were no enemy dead, 2 Leathernecks wounded, and 1 killed. In the plan were 2 destroyer minesweepers, the Southard, DMS-10, and the Zane, DMS-14, which were to shell Bungana Island, where it was reported the enemy had an outpost. At about the same time, however, the Southard and Zane were fired on by a small-caliber gun from the Japanese outpost on Bungana, but the 11-man detachment could only hope to sidetrack the destroyers with its ineffective machine gun. While the 2 minesweepers were returning the fire, the first wave of landing craft, Company C, 1/2, from the President Jackson passed between them on their way to the line of departure. The minesweepers offered some form of protection for the landing force. Robert Tallant of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, wrote an acerbic appreciation of the place. "Florida Island was some of the most inhospitable real estate I've ever patrolled. I did considerable snooping and pooping on Florida. The natives existed on the shorelines. Inland, about the only fauna that could hang on, were nests of purple worms, bats, and a few discouraged parrots without stamina to seek better climes. The Japanese who fled to Florida or were stationed there had to raid the native gardens to stay alive. They were miserably sick and war-weary, as if we weren't almost in the same shape ourselves. Ceuta Mission is the only really habitable place on the island. It was a delightful place to defend. The geography of Florida is irregular, with sharp peaks up to 1,366 feet high and rounded hills. The island is well wooded, with occasional grassy tracts bare of trees. Inland there are numerous freshwater streams, and in certain places mangroves border the sandy beaches. The water is spotted with dark coral that appears black. Over the centuries, the crushed coral has become black sand. When the Americans landed on Tulagi on the 8th of August, a lone Japanese, 25-year-old SM Norio Ojihara of the Command Platoon, 3rd Company, Kure 3rd SNLF, escaped by swimming to Florida Island. He was captured a month later by Malaita constables, led by Corporal ETO, who located him in a native village near Haleta. He had been coexisting with the islanders, some of whom had fed him. When he encountered the police, he attempted to communicate, but instead they seized him, then took him to Tulagi and turned him over to the Marines. Ojihara was later sent to a New Zealand POW camp and survived the war. The Japanese had established 2 lookout stations when they occupied Tulagi, one at Bungana Island and the other at Cape Horn, Florida Island, a total of some 22 sailors, plus radio operators. These stations were wiped out early in the Guadalcanal campaign by elements of the 2nd Marines. 1 man surrendered. The largest group of Japanese loose on Florida Island was from the Halavo Naval Air Station. The Japanese had established a floatplane base on the 1st of July 1942 at Halavo Bay, equipped with 12 Nakajima A-6MN Type 2 roof, including 2 spares. The planes were operated by the Hama Air Unit of the Yokohama Air Group, which had Kawanishi H, 6K Type 97, Mavis, flying boats headquartered nearby on the twin islands of Tanambogo and Gavutu. The Seafighter base had 4 commissioned officers as pilots: Lieutenant Sudar Richiro Sato of Okigawa, Japan, commanding officer, W.O. Tokuchiyo Hirahashi, Sato's executive officer, and W.O.s Fumiro Kurosawa and Hisateru Kofuji on Sato's staff. The Halavo fighter base had 7 non-commissioned officers as pilots and 36 others as ground crew. On occasion, Commander Sato and Warrant Officer Hirahashi would take a break from mosquito-ridden Florida Island and travel to Gavutu, where they could enjoy refreshments at the Officers' Club, a building on the pier just south of the causeway, and the companionship of their fellow officers. The 2 were avid camera buffs. Hirahashi often took aerial photographs, and Sato used his Zeiss icon to photograph both the flying boats off Gavutu and his own squadron at Halavo. 2 of Commander Sato's pilots were lost in combat in July. NAP-1C Tatsuo Hori and NAPI-1C Saburo Matsui, and NAP-1C Shigeto Kobayashi was missing in August. All had tangled with the American B-17S. The 2 spare roofs had been flown to Poparang Strait Seaplane Base #1 on Poparange Island, the Japanese airbase in the Shortlands, and thus missed the 7th of August American attack on Florida Island. 1 pilot was Warrant Officer Kofuji, the other unknown. At dawn on the 7th of August, 7 roofs at anchor off Halavo were sunk by the fighters of VF-71 from the Wasp. With their air station under attack, the airmen scattered inland to safer ground, but as the days passed, food there became scarce. To solve the problem, Commander Sato soon split his group of some 40 men into 3 parties of about 13, each going a separate way to search for food. Before they had been forced to split up, however, some members of Sato's group had captured a large pig for their sustenance, an action that had infuriated the natives. They wanted revenge for the loss of their own valuable food supply and boated to Tulagi to file a report indicating that about 40 Japanese had been in the area of Gumba. To pacify the islanders, the Tulagi command promised to hunt down the thieves, but it required guides to show the way. Lieutenant James R. Clanahan, called by the enlisted men Fancy Clancy or Jungle Jim, of Company C, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, was selected to lead the raid patrol. His party boated to Florida Island, led by the native guides. Jungle Jim Clanahan's Marines hit upon a bivouac area of the Yokohama Airmen. They attacked from the south and west at Gumba about noon and pressed forward when they found that no guards had been posted. They found several airmen in a clearing under a native-style shelter, some talking, some playing games, and some sleeping. An estimated 16 Japanese in the group, including Commander Sato, Wose Kurosawa, and Hirahashi, and PO-3C Mitsutaro Ito. When the Marines opened fire, the startled Japanese bolted in all directions. 7 vanished into the jungle to the west. Commander Sato, who had been in the open clearing, and 5 others were dead. Sato's family sword would have been of little use against Marines with automatic weapons. A few days after Lieutenant Clanahan's Florida Island shootout, the Malaita police constables killed a single Japanese. The papers found on his body indicated that he was one of Sato's airmen. Other members of Sato's band either starved to death or were killed by natives over time. John R. Brakeman of Company C, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, part of Lieutenant Clanahan's group, relates the story in more detail. I do not recall whether our mission was to annihilate or to capture an isolated group of Japanese. As we knew it, this party was camped out in a grassy glade, deep in the jungles of Florida Island. A native informant, I think his name was Alex, who was a big guy and always carried a club, and his leader, a little man, appeared to be in charge. They gave us a detailed description of the location and their daily living habits. The plan was to move inland as a single group, and upon arriving in the general area, split up into 3 groups, which would surround the area, all without detection, of course. At an assigned signal, or on being detected, we were to attack the entire force. I was the barman assigned to sneak up on an outpost sentry and block any escape. The sentry was not in place. His post was a huge banyan tree, and I crawled up on the opposite side of the tree. When the signal was given to fire, one member of the enemy group dashed out of the camp center and dived into a copse or thicket about 50 yards in front of me. Because a section of our patrol was directly behind him, I did not shoot, and to my knowledge that one survived the raid. The firing lasted only a few minutes, when we assembled and began the hectic and headlong pell-mell retreat to the location of the Higgins boats, which were waiting for us. One of our Marines, a big guy, was overcome with heat exhaustion from this wild and disorganized exodus, and had to be carried out of there. This was surely indicative of Clanahan's leadership. The raid had been a big success, except for one survivor. Actually, there were 3. Only the flying personnel were armed with pistols. The 3 airmen who survived out of the 7 who had managed to scamper to the safety of the lush jungle were SM Shigeru Saito, PO-3C Tadashi Ito, and Warrant Officer Hirahashi. Ito and Hirahashi were unhurt, but Saito had been severely wounded in the forearm. The men kept together and headed north. However, Saito's condition worsened each day. Within 3 days, they reached Undu Rock, Ahuha Island, off the north coast of Florida Island. At about 0800 on the 23rd of August, they approached some natives to seek food, but were seized, bound, and transported by canoe to a little island where they remained tied up until the following morning. When word reached Tulagi that the Florida Islanders had seized 3 Japanese, Lieutenant Clanahan was ordered to pick up the Japanese package. With Clanahan were 5 members of Company C, including Pietz, B.N. Bernie Pipert, and Charles Rosie Rosales. Upon their return, Saito was immediately sent to the hospital. Ito and Hirahashi were locked in the Tulagi prison. Saito's badly festered arm was in critical condition, and in an attempt to save his life, the doctors used captured Japanese medical instruments to amputate the arm at the elbow. Shortly afterward, however, because of his weakened condition and the trauma of the operation, Saito died. He lies buried somewhere on Tulagi. Also escaping to Florida Island were 22-year-old NAP-2C Narakazo Yusura of Osaka, Japan, a pilot from the flying boat detail on 323 war in the outer islands Gavutu, and 2 companions. They had left the carnage on Gavutu by swimming to Florida Island on the evening of the 8th of August. They did not seek out any other Japanese and saw none. They ate what they could find. In September, one of Yusura's companions died from malaria, and in time the 2 remaining airmen separated. On the 26th of December, Yusura was captured by an island constable and taken to Tulagi. He eventually was sent to the POW camp in New Zealand and survived the war. The other airman was never heard from again. The Marines patrolling the island, with the help of natives, occasionally would find a Japanese straggler, but most would not surrender. Between August and December of 1942, the Marine Defense Command on Tulagi dispatched some 48 combat patrols to comb the jungle of Florida Island, looking for Japanese stragglers. Men were drawn from the 2nd and 10th Marines and the 3rd Barrage Balloon Squadron for the task. Late in the war, one company from the 147th Infantry Regiment and one from the 132nd Infantry Regiment, U.S. Army, took over when the Marines departed. The war on Florida Island is not covered in the histories of the Guadalcanal campaign, as only a few skirmishes occurred there. Yet the Marines trudged through and fought in that stinking jungle, and Japanese died there. Malaita Island also played a small part in the war in the Solomons, but it was a role at a grave stage of the Guadalcanal campaign. The island spans about 103 miles from northwest to southeast and 23 miles at its greatest width. It lies some 60 miles from Guadalcanal. A former trader, Mr. A. Braille, described it as for the most part thickly populated and called the native there a fighter, the Gurkha of the South Seas. The interior is practically unexplored. Headhunters, along with Molecular in the New Hebrides, one of the 2 last dangerous ports of the world left. It was the most populated of the major islands, and its people had been the most warlike for centuries. During the 1800s, it was said that a shipwrecked sailor cast up on Malaita could count his life by minutes, not by days. Since 1909, the coastal town of Auki had been Malaita's chief port and the district officer's station. The quarters on the station were predominantly native-style leaf houses, 6 buildings, including the district officer's house, the ration store, a small hospital, a prison, and an armory. All had rusty, red-painted, galvanized iron roofing. For safety, most of the Solomon Island government staff had moved from Tulagi to Auki in February 1942, though resident Commissioner William S. Marchant did not remain in Auki, but instead took up quarters in the bush village of Fulisango, about 4 miles up the ridge and 8 miles from the west coast, facing Florida Island. The Reverend Walter Hubert Baddeley, Bishop of Melanesia, and Harry W. Bullen, Secretary of the Church of Melanesia Diocese, were also quartered in the vicinity. With Bishop Baddeley's group were 2 teachers, Sister Veronica and Sister Madeline. Malaita also had its share of missionaries who had evacuated from other islands, some from Guadalcanal. Most took to the back country and carried on their religious work. On the 4th of August 1942, while the invasion force was en route to the southern Solomon Islands, the seaplane tender Mackinac, AVP-13, as an advanced lookout station, arrived on Maramasike Passage, in a secluded cove on Malaita Island, which was by then codenamed Ecstasy. The Mackinac was the mothership to 9 flying boats, all PBYs of U.S. Navy Patrol Squadron VP-23, which were to keep an eye peeled for any Japanese vessels. On board for a while was a U.S. Navy lieutenant who would later become one of the best-selling authors in the world, James A. Michener. Van Watts, a member of the crew, recalled, "We would take Michener on what may have been, I guess, the ride of his life, picking him up and leaving him 2 weeks later at our rear base, the New Hebrides island of Espiritu Santo. It was there, during the next 18 months, he would write his first novel. In it he would have his narrator say in his only partly fictionalized work, 'I never saw a battleship except from a distance. I never visited a carrier or a cruiser or a destroyer. I never saw a submarine. But Missioner did sail on at least one naval vessel in the first of her narrow escapes from the Solomons, the little seaplane tender, called the Mighty Mac. We called her by the number on her bow, the Lucky 13. She was lucky all right, lucky enough to survive with Missioner aboard, the most advanced post in World War II's famous First Offensive. Strange, but not so strange, that modest fellow never seems to have mentioned it. But if you ever wondered where he was the day the action began, he was with us, up front, way up front, at an island shown on military maps behind enemy lines, refueling planes under the very noses of the enemy. On the 7th of August, 60 miles north of Guadalcanal at Maleta, the Mackinac would be refueling the planes that scouted the enemy. The success of one of the war's most daring exploits would depend completely on lack of detection. The Mackinac had been charged off in advance as part of the price for Guadalcanal. There was no question of her presence eventually being discovered. An overaged destroyer converted into a seaplane tender and sent into the area to refuel scouting planes in advance of our landing in the southern Solomons had been gambled and lost. No one could have honestly expected the Mackinac to return. But on the 5th day, the 9th of August, with still a bare chance of her own survival, the Mackinac would be ordered to evacuate the most advanced post. As we upped anchor and sailed, the last of her big PBYs flew over to warn that 40 Japanese bombers had been sighted heading her way. Either they were after bigger game, or they didn't see the speck below that was us. For tailing far behind a departing fleet, and in the face of superior enemy forces, retiring as fast as it could go, the mighty, and mighty lucky little, Mac escaped with Missioner and company. 8 days later, we would head north again to set up another advance base at Ndeni, Santa Cruz Islands, leaving him at Espiritu Santo. We never saw him again, but years later we would read in the press that he had retreated to a jungle shack and began writing the stories that were to appear in Tales of the South Pacific. Back on the 31st of July, 1942, en route in a 3-masted schooner from Tulagi to their new lookout post on Maleta at the village of Afufu near Cape Astrolabe, 21 sea infantrymen from the 3rd and 4th Squads, 1st Platoon, 1st Company, Kure 3rd SNLF, under W.O. Yoshiharu Muranaka, together with 2 radio men from the 85th Communication Unit, went ashore at Auki Maleta to investigate. The district officer, Captain C.N.F. Bengao, having been alerted to the Japanese presence, took to the bush. Upon arrival, P.O.3 Kazuo Yoshida and his sailors tore down the British flag, threw it on the ground and trampled on it. They did not replace it with their own sun disk pennant, however, since the only flag available belonged to SME Ryutaro Minakami, and that flag would later be flown over their camp on North Maleta. The Japanese troops went from house to house in the minute Auki community, but caused no major damage, nor did they discover the important radio station located about 4 miles up the Quibla River from Auki, at an elevation of 3,000 feet. The station formerly had been at Tulagi, but was dismantled and shipped to Maleta in February 1942. Lieutenant Thomas O. Sexton of the BSIP Defence Force operated the radio station from February 1942 to January 1943, when he was replaced by Lieutenant Robert S. Taylor, BSIPDF, the former Tulagi government radio supervisor. Sexton was in touch with the Coast Watcher network throughout the Protectorate, as he maintained the link between the Australian intelligence section at Noumea, Radio Cactus on Guadalcanal, and the resident commissioners at both Vila, Efate Island, and Port Moresby, New Guinea. In December 1942, U.S. Army Sergeant Clifford R. Kurtz arrived to assist Taylor with his work. Kurtz had logged 3 months on Guadalcanal as a radio operator with the 164th Infantry and was on detached service. He is the only GI known to have been assigned duty on Maleta. He remained there until March 1943. When the Japanese troops withdrew from Auki after 2 hours that last day of July 1942, the local islanders picked up the fallen British banner and raised it again. The Japanese continued their sail up the coast and made their camp at Cape Astrolabe. Once there and unloaded, their schooner returned to Tulagi. The Japanese began radio operations from Cape Astrolabe, contacting Tulagi as soon as the equipment was functioning. Their signal was picked up by Lieutenant Taylor, who promptly radioed both Noumea on New Caledonia and Guadalcanal. The new enemy lookout post on Malaita was established adjacent to Raw Creek, a clear water stream that ran into a sandy beach area. The Japanese campsite was about 200 yards inland. Seaman Minakami's flag, with his name written on it, proudly flew over the camp until the 4th of November 1942. Meanwhile, District Officer Captain Bengo had been keeping his constabulary busy observing the movements of the Japanese. As soon as his new neighbours had settled in, he relayed their actions to Radio Ken, the Coastwatcher network station on Guadalcanal. One message reported that on the 6th of August, 4 roofs from the Yokohama Air Group fighter unit based at Halavo, Florida Island, had dropped 2,132-pound bombs on the Fowondo mission on the north coast, 6 miles from their spotter location, killing 6 islanders. The natives were stunned and frightened by the attack. Not only had death rained down on them, but they had never seen an airplane, much less 4 at one time. On D-Day, the 7th of August, Admiral Fletcher's adrenaline-charged carrier pilots of Task Force January 1st 61, the air war heroes of the morning, outdid the Japanese, mistakenly bombing 2 artificial islands in Langalanga Lagoon on Malaita Island, islands that had resulted from oceanic eruptions. Possibly they mistook the very small masses for Japanese warships. 18 islanders were killed on one island and 22 on the other. One of the ugly ducklings, the PBYs, so named by crew members based in Muramasiki Passage, joined in the game and planted a bomb squarely on the South Sea Evangelical Mission's $15,000 launch, Arosi, sinking her. The plane also dropped another 250-pound calling card at the mission's Bible school at Wanpusu, but it failed to explode. The islanders subsequently brought the bomb to a missionary, A.J. Waite, and asked what kind of bird could have laid such a large egg. The bomb was promptly dropped into the sea. The PBY's mission that day had not been good public relations work by the U.S. Navy. The Japanese lookout post at Cape Astrolabe in North Malaita, the Japanese called it Mato, received its first visitors at 1,000 on the 26th of August, when 2 downed airmen walked into the station. They were dressed in full heavy flight gear, the winter-heated type, which they soon shed down to their loincloths. While on a 3-plane mission, a VAL, IHED 3A Type 99 carrier bomber had lost sight of its companion planes after running into a large squall. Failing to make radio contact with the others or their base, the VAL's crew eventually ran out of fuel and made a crash landing on the sandy beach at Malu Harbour. The craft overturned, but they managed to salvage a revolver, a machine gun, and 4 magazines of ammunition. The pilot, NAP-2C Yokio Hikinune, and his radio man, PO-2C Goichi Koretsune, remained at the crash site overnight. The following morning they attempted to destroy their aircraft, but it would not burn. Naval air pilot Hikinune recorded his impressions. "We went ashore hungry and tired and dozed off at the foot of a large tree. Natives talking awakened us. We were on the alert, but there seemed nothing to fear, for they beckoned us and did not seem to intend any harm. We were greatly relieved. By simple English and motions with our hands and body, we informed them that we were Japanese and inquired whether any white men were about. When we told them we were Japanese, they blurted out some indescribable laughs and nodded their heads, and from this we judged they were friendly." The 2 men were invited into a house located about 20 minutes away. It did not appear to be the usual native structure. The islanders offered them cooked yams, and by all gestures were friendly. Hikinune and Koretsune rested there for the night and slept well. The following day, one of the 20-some islanders gathered there volunteered to lead the pair to the Japanese post at Cape Astrolabe. The Solomon Protectorate had been served by missionaries since before the turn of the century. Often their numbers were higher than all other Caucasians combined. Malaita had been the last major island to succumb to missionary influence, but when this occurred, in the mid-1930s, the effects became deep-rooted. When Tulagi was evacuated in February 1942, the word had gone out that the Solomons were threatened. Some missions closed down and their members returned to New Zealand, but other faiths moved their operations to Malaita, where they had established a toehold. The Reverend Canon Charles Elliott Fox was from the Melanesian mission at Ceuta Point, Florida Island, which later became a 2nd Marine Regiment lookout post. He later became an unofficial coast watcher in northern Malaita. Fox had come to the Protectorate when he was 23. He finally returned to New Zealand at the age of 98. Archdeacon Harry Reynolds was also on Malaita, but he travelled to outer islands whenever possible to continue his work as a priest and coast watcher. Other mission workers at the village of Takwa in North Malaita included Fathers Claude Palmer and James Wall from Australia and Father Joseph Halbswash from France, Sisters Mary Xavier from France, Mary Duguay from the United States, Mary Francis from New Zealand, Fathers Daniel Stuyvenberg from the Netherlands and Donatien Coicot from France, Sisters Mary Salome and Mary Laurent from France, Mary Faustine from Italy, Mary Immaculate from New Zealand, Father Christopher Campuis from the Netherlands. Nearby at the Rohinari mission was his countryman, Father Bernard van der Walle. General Vandergrift became aware that white missionaries were still on Guadalcanal behind Japanese lines. In a daring night sortie led by Dick Horton in the Ramada, Bishop Aubin and the sisters were picked up and transported to Lunga. The Caucasian nuns were sent to New Caledonia, and by special permission, the bishop was allowed to go to Malaita to join others in his flock. Sisters Mary Raphael from France and Mary Methoda from Yugoslavia, Father Thomas Parsonage from New Zealand. Father E. Cortez from Great Britain at the remote Wanoni Bay, San Cristobal Island. Headed by Dr. Norman Deck, also very active during the conflict with the service of A.J. Waite, R.C. Vance, K.E. Griffiths, V.M. Sullivan, Clark, and J.B. Hoban. The closest civilized locale to Malaita's Cape Astrolabe outpost had occasional problems with Japanese sailors who often visited the mission hospital seeking food and medicine. Sometimes they raided, other times they came begging, depending on which NCO was in charge at the time. Cameron Buffett, originally from Norfolk Island, some 500 miles off east-central Australia, worked as a carpenter at the hospital. When the Japanese made surprise visits, he left. Nurse Nellie Steed, formerly from the Ceuta mission on Florida Island, worked in the bush with the islanders and returned to the hospital only when she ran out of medical supplies. Sister Talbot also worked in the bush country. Dr. Thompson remained at his station when the Japanese arrived, and they did not harm him, probably thinking that a nearby physician might be useful. The island missionaries had an intense devotion to duty. Sister Christine Woods, a nurse at the mission hospital at remote Ugi, San Cristobal, successfully petitioned to be allowed to go to Malaita where her services might be needed more. The problem of how to get her from Ugi, actually the hospital was at Tiny Pawa, to Fawabu was resolved when a church launch, the Gwen, well hidden in the mudflats at Fawabu, was dug out and sent to Ugi to pick up Nurse Woods. Later, the Gwen was returned to its hiding place. On the 3rd of September, the Japanese at the Cape Astrolabe lookout station dispatched an urgent message to the Taivu Point station on Guadalcanal, declaring that they had 2 weeks of rations left. A reply 3 days later indicated they soon would be supplied by submarine, the I-26. On the 20th of September, the men at the lookout station sent another telegram. "We are short of rations. We only have 2 days' rations left." A similar request followed 2 days later. By the 25th, the Camp Astrolabe station was out of rations, and 4 food seekers, Seaman Inoshita and Oneya and the 2 aviators, went to a nearby village where they secured bananas, coconuts, and papaya, and the islanders put on a dance for their entertainment. No food had arrived from the outside, and thus their main subsistence was island produce and fish. On the 27th of September, the now stranded garrison started eating rice gruel for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They had expected a submarine with rations on the 4th of October, but none arrived. By that time the radio was useless, the batteries were dead. Around then, a second Japanese aircraft crashed on Malaita. The Betty bomber apparently had been damaged by the anti-aircraft gunners on Guadalcanal. This time, however, District Officer Bengao's constables managed to capture the downed Japanese aviators, NAP-1C Mutsu Araki, NAP-2C Masatake Kato, and NAP-3C Toyo Oda. The three were sent under the guard of scouts Bethisara and Tomei to coast watcher Martin Clemens at AOLA on Guadalcanal. They arrived there on the 9th of October and later were transferred to the POW compound at Lunga. On the 27th of October, the hungry Cape Astrolabe Japanese had a feast when a stray cow was rounded up and butchered. But that provided only a brief respite, for on the 1st of November, a diarist reported, "It is exactly 20 days since we ran out of rations." On the following day, a B-17 flew a few hundred feet over the Japanese camp taking sightings. This should have been a warning that something big was brewing, as a flying fortress was seldom seen over their area. Emperor Meiji's birthday was on the 3rd of November, but contrary to custom, the forlorn detachment did not celebrate. Half of the men had malaria, and the other half were too tired to pay homage. A diary entry for that date reads, "We must leave everything up to fate. I am sure there is no fear of death." Over a month earlier, on the 28th of September, at Noumea, Admiral Richmond Turner, in a communication to General Vandergrift, suggested that the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Evans F. Carlson, the renowned Carlson's Raiders, be utilized to attack the Japanese outposts at Cape Astrolabe, at Morao Sound on the southeast end of Guadalcanal, and at Cape Hunter on the south coast of Guadalcanal. Based on the foregone conjectures, now would seem to be the time to push hard as possible on the following items. A. Continue clearing out all nests of enemy troops on the north side of Guadalcanal, initial operations continuing westward. I believe you are in a position to take some chances and go for them hard. I am glad to see Rupertus, Brig. General William H., is cleaning up Florida Island, and believe he should establish detachments on Sandfly Passage, the north coast, Matumba Bay at the eastern end of Florida, as soon as justified. Here we are working up a scheme to start out within a few days with 2 APDs available and 2 companies of second raiders to attack the Japanese outposts at Camp Astrolabe, Malaita, Morao Bay on Guadalcanal, and at Cape Hunter. We want to coordinate these operations with you and get your approval of our plan. Therefore, the commanding officer of the 2nd Raider Battalion, after conference with me, will shortly fly up and see you and go over the plans with you. One question to decide is whether or not to leave small detachments of second raiders at these places. At a later time, we would relieve them with other line troops. General Vandergrift, however, wanted the second raiders for other commitments. The 2nd Marine Command on Tulagi was aware of the enemy observation post overlooking Indispensable Strait on Malaita Island and had made plans to eliminate it. Major John Mather, the Australian liaison officer, was sent from AOLA in a Vought OS-2U Kingfisher amphibian to confer with District Officer Bengao. Mather remained at Auki for 3 days, and a plan was worked out between Major D.W. Fuller, Executive Officer of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, 1st Lieutenant J. Wendell Crane, and Sergeant Robert S. Suggs. A 7-team strike force was to be formed of 40 men from Company 1, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, with Lieutenant Crane in overall command. Team #1, Sergeant Richard E. Patch, Jr. Team #2, CPL, Charles F. Pyatt Team, #3, Sergeant Thomas I. Chapman Team #4, 1st Sergeant Clifford J. Robichard, Jr. Team #5, CPL, Manley J. Ewait Team #6, Sergeant Orley S. Berner Team #7, CPL Arthur G. Gordon. Added to the force were a doctor and a corpsman, Lieutenant Robert M. Adams, MC, USNR, and PHM 1C Herbert R. Fuller, Jr., USNR. 4 native scouts, Alequona, Abanari, Milati, and Selenitha. Plan was set in place on the 2nd of November. At 1400, the Malaita strike force assembled at Tulagi and boarded the slow and noisy Chug-Chugs, Nanui and Jones, headed for Malaita's chief port of Auki. The force arrived at midnight after a stormy voyage and remained at Auki during that day. Lieutenant Crane made supplementary plans with Captain Bengao for the raid on the Japanese lookout post. One of the scouts reported, "The outpost had one tent covered with green coconut fronds on the main road, about 300 yards southwest of a machine gun post. Overhanging rock about 200 yards inland was used as an air raid shelter. The post was well defined to our intelligence. It consisted of 22 men armed with rifles and automatic weapons. The Malaita Island Police Unit had consistently studied the Japanese schedule and movements and had obtained additional last-minute information useful to the strike force. Bengao furnished a detailed map of the enemy camp that his constable scouts had made. When the Marines were ready to shove off, the scouts led the way. Lieutenant Crane recalled the raid in detail years later. "We stayed overnight with Bengao and heard, 'This is London calling at 6:00 p.m, BBC. He had a hand-cranked radio that he turned on every night for the broadcast. The next morning, in an open field adjacent to his house, an old 3-room house painted white, we laid out a simulated area that the Japanese were occupying. We had 7 teams of 5-7 men per team, each headed by an NCO. The Japanese camp we were to attack was near the beach. A native road, hardly large enough for a jeep, ran along the beach area. The sandy beach was probably 20-40 yards wide, bordered by the road with the enemy camp inland from the road. The camp was in an open area, probably 150-200 yards in diameter in a clearing. A stream running into the ocean, 100 yards farther north from the camp, had been used for bathing, drinking, and washing clothes. We planned to get into position, surround the camp about 4-5 a.m., 1.5 hours before daylight. We were to wait and watch. When the Japanese got up to start their day, they would usually go to an open-sided mess hall for their meal. That was the time we were to open fire. We had very tight timing. We counted them as they entered the mess hall. We were not sure of the number, since it was reported 1-2 airmen had recently been shot down and swam to the camp. We estimated, the native scouts, the time it would take moving from down the beach, the British officer's house, to a point about 1/2 mile short of the camp. We were moving up the native road until then. At that point, 1/2 mile away, a native policeman would guide each team inland and approach the camp from there. Our goal was to spot the 7 teams in an arc around the camp, move as close to the open area as each team could, yet staying under cover in the dense jungle that surrounded the camp. We had about 40 men, moving at night, in deep jungle, led into place by natives who spoke only pidgin English. Visibility was bad. Teams had to hold hands to keep from getting lost. We found some native roots that glowed in the dark, phosphorus, and each team member could see a faint light. Silence was imperative. We moved into position. All teams, no one lost. Probably around 5 a.m, still dark, but getting light soon. I was with a side team near the centre of the camp. Another report of the events further described the situation. It was getting light as we circled the camp. The Japanese were occupying a small clearing on the coastal road built by the British. We could see 4 open-sided shacks, a galley, a mess hall, and a storehouse. There was also a wireless shack, our main objective. We crawled on our bellies to within 15 yards of the mess hall. It was the funniest thing to lie there and watch them walking around, washing up, brushing their teeth and getting ready for chow. We waited. At 7:45, 14 of them were in the mess hall. Watching them eat made us feel hungry. They were wolfing native potatoes, bananas, and drinking coffee. We had waited because we hoped to get them all together, but when we saw 2 of them getting ready to leave, I gave the signal to fire. The plan was that no team was to open fire until our team began firing. In an emergency, a team, if they had been discovered, could fire. Support fire came in from all teams. To my knowledge, we received no return fire, although they were armed with rifles and machine guns. 1 or 2 had strolled down to the small stream for an early bath or to wash clothes. They didn't come to breakfast. They were killed or captured, and 1 was brought back to Tulagi. The natives possibly later killed the 2 airmen. The firing was over in a few minutes. We picked up all gear, ammo, codebooks, radios and weapons, and had the natives bury the dead Japanese. We sent runners down the beach to bring the native boats back to camp. Former pharmacist's mate, Herbert R. Fuller, remembered one darkly comic moment that occurred before the teams opened fire. Picture, if you can, we had been lying in position for about an hour. We were waiting for the auto-firing of the middle section of the team. The BRs, etc., were in very close range to the mess table area. All our senses were super alert. And then came the tinkling sound of someone relieving his bladder over the dump. War in the outer islands, and the sound came from a stream of liquid hitting someone's helmet, not any tin can. Some Japanese was passing water on a helmet of one of the automatic firing group. The irate Marine was noiseless and cussing to himself, half startled but furious. Later he stated in no uncertain terms his anger and how he'd wished the order to fire had been given at that instant, how he wanted to shoot that SOB then and there, even though against orders. I suppose he never lived that down, a brief encounter that allowed the Japanese to urinate all over him while he remained motionless, then let the Japanese get away with it, but only briefly. As a word of explanation, I shot that Japanese. The epilogue to the story is recounted by a member of Lieutenant Crane's force. When it was all over, we were treated by the natives as heroes. They had been living happily under British rule and had been severely plundered by the Japanese, who had lived off their gardens and stolen their chickens. When they saw all the Japanese had been killed, they made a really gala occasion and brought us all kinds of fruit and some of their native wine. The fruit was very welcome, and when we had finished, they serenaded us with native songs. I felt that we ought to respond, so we all stood up and sang from the halls of Montezuma, and that pleased them more than ever. When we left, they all lined up by their chief and gave 3 cheers in typical British fashion. We could hear them yelling as we went back to the jungle. The Japanese that had been captured was SM Shohei Fukuda, second in command of the lookout post. According to his POW report, during the skirmish he was hit in the right knee and dropped to the ground. Corpsman Fuller tended to his injury, bandaging the knee so that Fukuda could limp to the boat. After a calm ride from Malaita, Lieutenant Crane's force and the one POW arrived at Tulagi at 0605 on the 5th of November. On the 23rd of July 1943, CNF Bengo was killed off the New Georgia Islands while flying in a New Zealand Hudson bomber to spot targets. He had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and was acting resident commissioner for the Solomon Islands. The Hudson was attacked by a Zero, and Bengow and the crew had to abandon the plane. Several members of the crew managed to get out, but the Japanese pilot machine-gunned them in the water. One man survived to tell the story. Hell's Islands, Rennell Island lying 160 miles south of the southern tip of Guadalcanal and nearly 100 miles south of San Cristobal. Rennell Island is one of the most isolated locales in the Solomons. At a meeting of the Royal Geographical Society in London on the 6th of March 1916, Charles M. Woodford, the first resident commissioner of the Protectorate, described Rennell and its neighbour Bellona. The Polynesian Islands, Rennell and the adjacent Bellona, are perhaps the most interesting in the Pacific because they have been so seldom visited and little has been recorded about their inhabitants. As there is nothing that can be called a safe anchorage and the natives have nothing to sell, the islands have been left to themselves. Eastward of where I landed, on Rennell, a large lake, Lake Tengano, exists. Dr. Norman Deck, of the South Sea Evangelical Mission, who first discovered it, states that its water is brackish, and that on the south shore of the lake, where there is considerable native settlement, the natives navigate the waters of the lake in sailing canoes. In contrast to the other islands of the Solomon Protectorate, Rennell and Bellona, once low-lying atolls, rise 300 feet out of the sea like coral sentinels. 45 miles long and 10 miles wide, Rennell Island is the world's largest raised coral atoll. It is surrounded by rugged perpendicular coral cliffs, and from the air appears to be ringed by a gigantic white necklace. Rennell had been an antediluvian coral reef with an enclosed lagoon that developed around an extinct volcano. The volcano's crater forms Lake Tengano, said to be the largest freshwater lake in the Pacific, though apparently, according to Charles M. Woodford, it was slightly salty. the island has one small open anchorage at Tuhunango. Rennell was so remote that the inhabitants were sometimes referred to as Stone Age people. After 3 mission native teachers had been killed there in 1910, the government closed the island to all visitors, and it was not until 1934 that teachers and missionaries were again permitted to visit. But isolated Rennell was already blessed in one respect. Its inhabitants had not contracted any of the European diseases, and it had no malaria. Although the island remained out of bounds to most Europeans, the Protectorate government, through the medical officer, allowed certain missionaries periodically to make short visits there. Once every few years, Dr. Deck and some of the mission staff travelled from Malaita to Rennell seeking converts. They were modestly successful, but the effort took nearly 30 years. In 1936, however, the government again closed Rennell to all visitors, for fear that the islanders would contract European diseases. Because there was no manner of communication with the remote atoll, the Allies did not know if it had been occupied by the Japanese, and thus a detachment from the rear echelon of the 2nd Marines on Espiritu Santo Island, New Hebrides, was sent to Rennell to establish a lookout station. Commanded by First Lieutenant Emmett N. Carter of Company A, Motor Transport, 2nd Service Battalion, the detachment comprised 8 enlisted men from the 2nd Marines, 3 U.S. Navy petty officers, and a coast watcher. They arrived on the 12th of November 1942 in a PBY flying boat, the first the islanders had seen. Lieutenant Carter kindly prepared the following account of the establishment of the lookout post at Lake Tengano and his detachment's sojourn on Rennell Island. My commanding officer, Captain Robert H. Sanders, came to the tent at a meeting of the company officers. He wanted a volunteer for a unique mission. He explained what we were to do, saying it was unknown whether or not the Japanese had occupied the island, and whether or not the natives were friendly or cannibalistic. We were to establish ourselves in the native villages without making any changes that would alert enemy aircraft. We would not engage the enemy under any circumstances except in our own defence. On the trip from the Curtis, I had the opportunity to spend some time with Petty Officer Andy Andresen. Andresen was on loan from the Australian Navy and had recently been shifted to Santo from Guadalcanal. An experienced coast watcher, he discussed with me the finer points of what was ahead of us. Andresen was fluent in Pidgin English, which was a great help in communicating with many of the islanders. Andresen had lived in the Solomons pre-war. Later on board the ship, we found out that there were no Japanese on the island. Our radio contact would be with the Curtis in code. The Curtis was one of our largest aircraft support vessels and fully equipped from A to Z. It was the command post and at this time the mothership for Patrol Squadron 23, VP-23. We loaded all our equipment on a PBY and were flown to Rennell Island. Our PBY landed on a very smooth lagoon, Lake Tengano, near a small village. We later learned there was one other village on the island. Before we could unload our rubber raft, the plane was surrounded by Polynesians, swimming and in their canoes. You would think the gods had sent us. They appeared to be friendly enough. Andresen and I were the first to step ashore and were immediately met by the chief, Tegeta, with whom we attempted to communicate. Andresen assisted me with our first negotiations with Tegeta and then departed with the PBY to return to Espiritu Santo. The big hit with the islanders were the trinkets we carried, as Andresen had forewarned us on how to make friends quickly in an unknown area. We had an ample supply of T-shirts, and soon most of the women were wearing them. We also had an ample supply of black stick chewing tobacco, beads and trinkets, but the most wanted item was machetes. Tegeta soon had vacated houses for us to move into. These houses were constructed of bamboo with leaf roofs. The one that we used for our headquarters was out over the water. If you dropped your pen, you had to dive to find it. The lake water was the principal source of fresh water for drinking, bathing, laundry, and all sanitation. We set up our own water treatment plant and latrine. A difficult task was setting up our radio at a point where it would be well hidden and close to a good lookout for us to stand watch. The natives helped us build something that could protect our equipment and was close to the point we selected for observing passing vessels and aircraft. It was well hidden from the air. After the PBY left, our team was isolated, except for wireless contact. Our first priority was to establish radio contact, and we reached the Curtis before the PBY arrived back at Espiritu Santo. Our two radio men, Bridenstine and Stone, knew their business, and with other communicators from the Marines, we soon put together a system for the job. We reported flotsam that had drifted to the island, some of which we could identify. Tegeta took us to the remains of a fighter that had crashed on the island. Facts and identity were reported. We reported air flights and ship convoys that we observed. Once, a Japanese submarine sent a few Japanese sailors ashore to recon the beach at the southern tip of the island. The formation of the island made this the only feasible place for anyone to come ashore from a ship. We did not make contact. They were never aware that we were on the island. Corpsman Carey proved to be very valuable on the mission. He had a good supply of medications, and he gave our men regular physical examinations. He kept busy administering aid to the people on the island. About 2 weeks after we arrived, one of our watchmen, Scott, reported that a large number of islanders were headed toward us from the southern end of Lake Tengano. I alerted all hands, but it turned out to be a friendly invasion consisting of the chief Taugongi from the other village bringing his people for medical treatment. Carey came to me shortly afterward and asked for permission to return with these islanders to their village. It seemed a girl there was dying, and they wanted our Dakata to help. This required a high-level conference between Tegeta, the other chief, and myself. They called me Masatakata. As a result, I sent Lovett to handle the boat and Sebi and Palmatier along with Carey to see what could be done. That mission was a success in that the pharmacist's mate was able to heal her. The treatment she was receiving from the local healing man was not doing enough. After about 25 days on the island, Sergeant Marsh became very ill. Marsh may have died had Carey been less knowledgeable. I requested through our radio contact with the Curtis that Marsh be evacuated from the island, but got no immediate confirmation. About this time our radio began cutting out on us, and we did not have spare parts to repair it. We made makeshift repairs, but they were not too successful. It was not long before a PBY arrived with radio replacement equipment and took Marsh to the hospital. We conducted recon missions every day, and encouraged the islanders to report on Japanese, or strangers, and the sighting of any vessels so we could check it out. Nothing exciting happened, and the men were busy with their particular tasks. We had our own supplies, which were supplemented with certain fruits and vegetables from the native gardens. If we had had to spend the rest of the war there on that lonely island, we would have suffered from sheer boredom. According to Chief Tegeta, Rennell had been discovered and explored by several other countries, French and Australian traders. Rennell is so isolated it was seldom visited by those from other islands, but some of those visits turned out to be violent. Through the years, fishermen had landed on the island and often took young women with them. They never returned. Missionaries landed several times and taught them various religions. The religion that seemed to take root was the Church of England. Young girls were often taken away to attend seminaries. Only one ever returned. She taught the islanders pidgin English and told them how the rest of the world lived. One fear that Tegeta had was of the Japanese invading the island after we left. He was also concerned that we might want to take some of his people with us when we left. I was invited to give the Christmas story to the entire Lake Tengano population on December 25th. It was questionable whether they received very much from my story. We closed the little station approximately on the 15th of January 1943. Headquarters on Santo sent a PBY to pick us up. We left all our gear there except the radio. On arrival at our base on Espiritu Santo Island, we were happy to learn that all the Santo Marines from our contingent were to be transferred to New Zealand. Our team was especially happy since New Zealand represented civilization. On reaching Wellington, we were all reassigned to our original outfits. We did our tour as coast watchers, but wished for action that would have had a positive effect on the war effort. It seemed we were on vacation, enjoying the sun while our fellow Marines were fighting the war. From my viewpoint, life would not be worth much if it had to be spent on this small bit of land. We all wanted to get back to our units and get some action. Later, all of us really got more than we bargained for. About 6 months afterward, I received a letter from the chief asking us to come back in the event of a Japanese attack. We did not return, and the Japanese did not attack. The chief's letter to Lieutenant Carter was possibly prompted by the battle waged in late January 1943 in and around Rennell's waters. During this engagement, a Zero, Model 21, from the Japanese 751st Air Group attacked the heavy cruiser Chicago. While the aircraft pummeled the cruiser from above, a Japanese submarine fired a spread of 6 long-lance torpedoes at the stricken vessel. The gallant Chicago, lifeless, eventually rolled over and sank. News abstracts from the 2 daily newspaper, published in Aomori City, Japan, on the 5th of February 1943, described the events. The latest sea battle results of the Seahawks, announced by the Grand Imperial Headquarters at 16 o'clock on the 4th. Persistent counterattacks by the enemy. Enemy damages are 3 times ours. Tokyo Dispatch. After the great results obtained in the sea battle off Rennell Island, including the sinking of 1 enemy cruiser, the damaging of another enemy cruiser, and shooting down 33 enemy planes, and in the battles of Isabel Island in the New Georgia sector, the number of enemy vessels sunk and damaged by the Imperial Navy in the South Pacific waters bordering the Solomons since the initial Solomon Island assault reaches a brilliant total of 134, and the number of enemy planes shot down exceeds 943. On the other hand, up to the other day, we made the exalted sacrifice of a total of 41 vessels sunk or damaged in our own waters, 243 self-destroyed or missing planes, and 32 severely damaged. In comparing friendly and enemy damage, the ratio is 3.3 times greater loss for the enemy in vessels and 3.7 times greater in planes. Comparing this recent ratio of damage to that which obtained in the initial engagement of last summer, a great decrease is evident. This fact indicates the fierceness of the battles in the South Pacific and shows how tenacious the enemy counterattacks are. Modern sea battles are truly one of the great expendables, TN, translation, Shomo Sen, a war of attrition, and here lies the reason why it must be won by a sure victory on the production front. While Tokyo was making these inflated claims, the Japanese army was secretly evacuating Guadalcanal. On the 28th of October 1942, Major Tadahika Hayashi, the 17th Army Cipher officer, arrived at Rabaul, New Britain Island, to confer with Major General Akisaruro Futami, Chief of Staff of the 17th Army Rear Area Headquarters. The Sun soldiers on Guadalcanal were plagued by a desperate food shortage, and Major Hayashi wanted to know what immediate steps could be taken to rectify the problem. The tense meeting emphasized the difficulties being caused by the American Air Forces, and a consensus was reached that prompted the Imperial Navy to reassign a number of submarines from combat patrols in the Indian Ocean to a supply mission for Guadalcanal. The 8th Base Force had already been using submarines for communications and resupply wherever possible. By the 10th of November, the I-15, the first of many Imperial Japanese Navy submarines, reached Kamimbo Bay on the far northwestern corner of Guadalcanal and unloaded supplies about 100 yards offshore. Suda Nobuo Ishikawa's 354-foot-long 584-ton underwater truck was one of 16 submarines reassigned from the Indian Ocean to the RXN resupply operation. But even that effort was not enough to feed 20,000 hungry and sick soldiers. The Imperial Navy had an impossible task. Each submarine could carry about 50 tons of supplies, which was just adequate for a 2-day food ration. As a result, the men of the 17th Army were slowly starving to death. The I-9, under Captain Akiyoshi Fuji, unloaded at Kamimbo Bay on the 26th of November. The following day, Lieutenant Sida Inoue and Dunan brought the 955-ton I-31, but she was attacked by the U.S. Navy's Tulagi-based Devil boats, the PTs, while delivering provisions at Cape Esperance. 2 torpedoes from PT-59 connected, sinking the I-31. The 17th Army, determined to get food to the island, also established a chain supply operation by sending Japanese Army Daihatsu landing barges to Guadalcanal. The barges, 49 feet long and 6.5 feet high, each could carry 10 tons, but could travel only 80 sea miles on a tank of gas at a crawling 8 miles per hour. Thus, a gas barge was required for fuel resupply. If the gas barge were sunk, they would face serious problems. The run would begin at Bougainville, the Army's main supply point, and from there make a quick pass to the nearby Shortland Islands off the tip of Bougainville, where the crews would rest during daylight hours. They would then head for Vella La Vella Island in the New Georgia Group, jump 35 miles to Gizo Island, and after that, sneak down the 160 miles to Cape Esperance on the northwestern tip of Guadalcanal. However, the Cactus Air Force sometimes caught and sank the ant runs, as the Americans called them, in the open sea on the long stretch between Gizo and Guadalcanal. December 1942 saw many adjustments on Guadalcanal Island. The American troop strength had increased, while the Japanese forces dwindled. More of the U.S. Army's American Division citizen soldiers, the weekend warriors, were arriving from the rear areas, and the Seabees were seen walking around Guadalcanal in new gear. A post exchange opened with basic necessities plus stationery. The troops no longer had to depend on captured Japanese rice paper on which to write their letters. One PX had a limited stock of 2.2 beer, but a small quantity of harder, bootlegged liquor could be purchased on the open market from visiting airmen at $100 plus per bottle. Usually the Seabees, who were older, had the first pick. Their average age was 33, the men the GIs and Marines called Gramps. With the U.S. Army came tents, and for the first time in months, some of the Marines could sleep under cover and out of the rain. A shortage of service troops still existed. Soldiers did not like being used as stevedores. But the situation began to improve on the 3rd of December, when the Solomon Islands Labour Corps was formed and islanders were put to work. 200 islanders in the first group were employed at the weekly rate of 5 shillings, $1.25. A month later, the Corps would number 1,450. The natives insisted on being paid with English shilling coins, the kind they had received before the war, and thus as much as $5,000 in British coins had to be flown in from Noumea. The native workers also would take American quarters, but the coins were scarce on the island. The Marines on Guadalcanal, however, were not as well situated as their brothers on Tulagi Island, who could purchase a large bunch of bananas for a nickel from the Florida Island natives, and a small bunch for a dime. They also could get their clothes washed each week for 25 cents, a luxury not available on Guadalcanal. Nevertheless, life on Guadalcanal was continuing to improve. On the 3rd of December, in addition to the new Labour Corps, more reinforcements poured in from the rear area base on New Caledonia, when the Hunter Liggett and the Kenmore, AP-62, landed elements of the 9th Defence Battalion, whose advance echelon had arrived on the 21st of November. The 9th was assigned as the major defence unit for the Coley Point sector, which was badly in need of anti-aircraft weapons. Admiral Turner also moved additional American Division formations, including the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 132nd Infantry Regiment, plus the 247th Field Artillery Battalion, less Battery A, and the 26th Signal Company. The 1st Battalion, 132nd, followed 5 days later. On the 9th of December at Mount Mambaloo, the native name for Mount Austin, 28 sailor warriors from Lieutenant Sigurd Akira Takizawa's Butai moved into the Gifu command post. Their numbers were down from the 114 that had landed in August. Named by men of the 230th Infantry Regiment from Gifu, Japan, and the 69th Infantry Regiment, the command post was located about 400 yards northeast of Hill 27, a hill the Americans would soon come to hate. About the same time, remnants of the 228th Infantry Regiment, 1st and 2nd Battalions, took up positions at the base of Mount Austin. They renamed their post Suemura Shitai for Colonel Masaichi Suemura of the 228th Infantry. The position had been named Doi Shitai before the death of Colonel Sadashichi Doi, the 228th commander who had been killed in a bombardment, The commanding officer of the 8th Company, 228th Infantry, First Lieutenant Iwao Fujita, established a spotter position between the 1st and 2nd observation stations at the base of Mount Austin, and Captain Yoshiyuki Sato from the 2nd Reserve Unit was placed in charge of security. The assaulting GIs were pushing the Nippon soldiers led by Major Takeyoshi Inagaki, 228th VR, into two valleys between hills 27 and 31 and hills 31 and 42, where it was said the Japanese fought like devils and the GIs took casualties. Major Haruja Nishiyama, commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, 228th Infantry, less the 9th Company under Captain Yataro Kasugi, and the 12th Company under First Lieutenant Tasuo Kobayashi, plus one machine gun platoon, ordered his men to defend the area south of northern Miharashi Dai, Hill 54, part of the Galloping Horse Ridge Mass just north of Seahorse Ridge, Hills 43 and 44, and to extend protection to the terrain west of Hill 49, Inu, Dog, and Hill 67. He also ordered the 1st Platoon, 11th Company, under Captain Kaizo Fukada, which was in the front line, to stand firm, then placed 1st Lieutenant Toichi Wakabayashi's 27 men of the 10th Company on the left of Captain Fukada's platoon. The Japanese were determined to remain in the hills and let the Americans come after them. Shuichiro Kato, a sergeant with the 2nd Battalion, 228th Infantry Machine Gun Company, told his POW interrogator, "After the unit was all landed, they took the trail up the Isamu River to Hill 903, US Hill 89. Here they crossed over the Matanikau and proceeded up to the area of Miharashi Dai, Hill 54. Then the unit split up, the 2nd Battalion going to help the Oka Unit, 124th Infantry, the 3rd Battalion staying at the Miharashi Dai, and headquarters and the 1st Battalion assigned to Sakai Dai, Skyline Ridge, Hills 75, 78, and 80. They maintained these positions until the final push." Pursuit Isamu Kinoshita's interrogator notes. There was plenty of ammunition for the 75mm guns. These were covered up with green cloth. He has not heard them fire for the last 10 days that he knows of. The artillery is waiting for a dark night before it really opens up. The 3 large guns have about 30 rounds of badly corroded ammunition. The battalion in front of his position has no artillery but only machine guns and mortars. The 2nd Marines, less the 3rd Battalion, had moved up between 11 and the 16th of December to relieve US Army units at the front, the deadly Matanikau River sector where the 2nd Marines had spent part of early November. The GIs dubbed the area the Snake Pit. Some deadly sparring was still occurring, with the Americans now being more aggressive as the Imperial Army still managed to hold its own. Cunning Japanese snipers infiltrated near enough to the American lines to fire off a few shots, and thus caution was the rule of the day. The last of the American Army formations reached Guadalcanal on the 13th of December, when the 3rd Battalion, 182nd Infantry Regiment, and part of the 57th Engineer Combat Battalion arrived from garrison duty on Espiritu Santo Island. Almost the entire American Division was now on the island. Admiral Turner, however, was most interested in establishing Guadalcanal as a major advanced naval base. He kept sending naval construction units in bits and pieces to the island on any ships available. He transported Company B, 18th NCB, on the SS Joseph Teal, which reached Lunga on the 3rd of December, followed by the bulk of Companies A and D, 18th Seabees, plus the headquarters, some 14 officers and 552 enlisted men, that arrived at Guadalcanal on the 12th. Company C arrived the next day, and finally, on the 19th of December, the rear echelon of 3 officers and 150 men landed at Lunga. A week later, the Haywood arrived with another load of 982 Seabees from the 26th NCB. They had been in the Navy for only 2 months when ordered overseas, reaching Noumea on the 10th of November. 6 weeks later, they were sweating in Guadalcanal's heat. Guadalcanal and Tulagi required an enormous amount of construction work, and the Seabees were just the right men to do it. By late December, over 4,000 were at work on both islands. However, Admiral Turner was not impressed with the naval management of the Guadalcanal base. In November, he had quickly replaced the first base commander, Captain James P. Compton of Cub 1, with Captain W. G. Greenman. A month later, he replaced Captain Greenman with Captain Thomas M. Shook. Shook was subsequently replaced by Captain H. L. Maples. Admiral Turner was determined that Cactus would be the best-run advanced base in the South Pacific, even with the Japanese less than 10 miles away. Progress was evident by the 22nd of December with the opening of Fleet Post Office 145 adjacent to the airstrip. The fastest-selling item was stamped 6-cent airmail envelopes. 9 months earlier, on the 12th of March 1942, Major General Alexander M. Patch had brought from Australia to New Caledonia a mixed bag of Federalized National Guard troops that formed Army Task Force 6418, the later Americal Division. They had been assigned as garrison troops for New Caledonia to blunt any Japanese attack. By October, however, with the enemy knocking at the door of Henderson Field, General Patch had transferred to Guadalcanal Colonel Bryant E. Moore's crack 164th Infantry Regiment of the North Dakota Guard to bolster the fatigued Marines. The men of the 164th would be followed later by additional elements supporting the Guadalcanal campaign, including a formation in the rear area, the 147th Infantry Regiment, which had transferred from Tonga to Cactus via Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides Islands. The 147th pre-war had belonged to the 37th Infantry Division. No longer part of a division, it was called the Orphan Unit, moving all across the Pacific area as an individual regiment. On the 8th of December, after being on Guadalcanal for 4 grueling months, the 1st Marine Division moved on to Australia, relinquishing command of the island and turning control of the war to the U.S. Army's General Patch. The departing units included the 1st and 5th Marine Regiments. Remaining were the 2nd, 7th, 8th, 10th and 11th Marines, some elements of which had been in the islands since D-Day, the 7th of August. The 1st and 5th Marines, 2 worn-out regiments, were eager to get away from the island of Hell where they had to leave behind so many of their comrades, both in numbered cemetery graves and in unmarked and unknown places. The men of D2, Division Intelligence Section, 1st Marine Division, in the operations bunker of the Division Command Post, the 2nd of December 1942, PFC Francis Massaro, Scout, CPL John C. Schiller, Jr., Senior Clerk, CPL Joseph J. Dickhouse, Observer, Pierceit Russell Esberger, Lithographer, PFC Edward G. Sexton, Photographer, CPL Robert M. Howard, Jr., Photographer. 2nd Lieutenant Arthur S. Clay, Assistant D2, 2nd Lieutenant Carl Thayer, Soule, Jr., Assistant D2, 2nd Lieutenant James H. Whitehead, Jr., Assistant D2, Captain Sherwood F. Moran, Language, Lieutenant Colonel Edmund J. Buckley, D2, Ensign Delancey, USN, Aerial Photo Interpreter, Major Richard Evans, Assistant D2, Ensign Summer, USN, Aerial Photo Interpreter. 2nd Lieutenant Levi T. Bersham, Aerial Photo Interpreter, CPL Anthony Meadin, Draftsman, 1st Lieutenant Jerome J. Foley, Aerial Photo Interpreter, CPL Frederick Peachy, Keeper of the Journal, CPL William F. Rugilio, Lithographer, Pourseat Thomas Dudgeon, Observer, CPL Ralph R. Wendling, Lithographer, CPL Edward L. Hall, Darkroom Back, PFC Richard K. Hance, Movie Photographer, PFC Earl K. Swenson, Darkroom Back, SS Jinkt Philip A. Edmondson, Chief, Photolithography, CPL Henry Siderman, Photo Interpreter, Back, Sergeant Henry D. Burnham, Draftsman, CPL Richard B. Barr, Observer, CPL Vernon C. Stimple, Draftsman, Corporal Slagheck, Section Chief, CPL William S. Donahue, Observer, Sergeant Leroy H. Wolfe, Assistant Section Chief. National Archives. Those who boarded the transports included a large number with severe health problems. In all, the 1st Marine Division had suffered 8,486 casualties. Of those, 774 were killed in action or missing, with 1,962 wounded. 3 men died of malaria, and the total afflicted with diseases was 5,750. They had suffered fever, chills, and dehydration, and they had been plagued with diarrhea, malaria, jungle rot, and at times almost starvation. Some of the men on stretchers directed to hospitals in Australia had been painted purple from the salve used to control jungle rot, a fungus condition they contracted from the unrelenting mud. The men on Guadalcanal had endured their time in hell, undergoing 170 air raids, 64 naval bombardments, and untold hours of combat. They had survived the bombardment of 614 of Pistol Pete's 105mm shells, which he had deposited in their midst. To the Americans the price was high, as each life was precious, yet much less costly than the bloody Boona battle on New Guinea, where 3,095 were killed in action and 5,451 wounded. The enemy had committed more than 50,000 troops, and by February 1943 had evacuated 10,085, leaving hundreds of sick and dying on the route to the withdrawal point. 18-year-old TSG Cht. Joseph G. Michek of Company G, 2nd Battalion, 132nd Infantry, Americal Division, debarked on Guadalcanal on the 8th of December, the last major element of the Americal to arrive. Michek recalls, the 8th of December. The first casualty I record was the death of 2nd Lieutenant Riley Morgan. I had known the lieutenant back in New Caledonia and heard he was shot through the heart while on patrol in our front lines. Many patrols have often fought each other by mistake, and quite a few were killed in this manner. A fellow's nerves get rather jittery, and he shoots at anything. The 11th of December. 3 companies of my battalion occupied a defence position along the beach. Others went to guard the airport. The 12th of December. Our mission was to send out patrols into the southern part of the island to make sure the enemy was under control. The 13th of December. We really caught hell from Maytag Annie tonight, as he came over about 2200 and dropped 18 bombs. Boy, did we hit our slit trenches. I could hear the shrill swishing sound of the bombs as they dropped. They do that to keep us awake. The 14th of December. New troops have been arriving almost every day. We expect to make a big push in the very near future. I also visited an American cemetery, which was within walking distance from our encampment area. Simple, green, crude, wooden crosses on each grave marked their final resting place. One grave had a propeller stuck in it. Others had 105 shells, while still others had the lids from their meat can covers over their humble gravesite with a short epitaph inscribed, "Most of these men were killed in the October offensive." When General Patch took over on Guadalcanal, his command had been briefed by the 1st Division on aspects of the battle conditions. Patch had experience in dealing with the French in New Caledonia and had become an expert in the art of diplomatic euphemism, but he had never engaged in jungle warfare, nor had anyone in the Green Americal Division. General Vandergrift and his 1st Division staff had witnessed the struggle since the beginning, and having seen the campaign expand day by day, they had developed an eye for the unexpected. Many of Vandergrift's majors and ranks above had served in jungle detachments in the banana countries and banana wars of South and Central America in the late 1920s. They were familiar with tropical forest conditions and with fighting in that environment. On the 15th of December, while American command adjustments were still in progress, an aggressive Japanese raiding party from the 38th Engineer Regiment, led by 1st Lieutenant Ono, broke through the lines, blew up a new P-39 Era Cobra and a gasoline truck, then escaped. The engineers also had made earlier successful forays, including one on the 12th, led by 2nd Lieutenant Nakazawa. At this time, however, the Japanese were also in the midst of command shuffles. At the Guadalcanal Naval Station, the younger Lieutenant Sada Tokunaga Okamura replaced Captain Kane Monzen. Monzen and his staff left the island on board the destroyer Ariake, bound for Rabaul. Both officers had been on Guadalcanal since the 6th of July. Over the previous few months, key Japanese naval officers had departed on any vessel returning to Rabaul. On the American side of the readjustment strategy, General Patch's team had not developed a coherent plan for dealing with the pressing issues. The staff, a mixed collection of American division officers, inexperienced and untested, formed the initial personnel for the U.S. Army's 14th Corps. Their major problem was the Japanese on Mount Austin's Hill 27. The assistant division commander, Brig General Edmund B. Sebree, believed a reinforced company supported by a battalion would be sufficient to clean up the enemy there. Sebree, a post, World War I graduate of West Point, had no combat experience and no jungle knowledge, a serious shortcoming. No one in command seriously understood the destructive pitfalls of the treacherous terrain or the Japanese military mentality, and this led to a flood of unnecessary casualties. The command therefore presented the 132nd Infantry Regiment with an almost impossible mission to neutralize the 920-foot promontory identified as Hill 27 on the maps, but called Bullet Junction by the GIs. The chief pursuit of the newly formed 14th Corps under the American division officers was to elbow westward in two stages. First, they were to eliminate the Mount Austin threat, where a concentration of Japanese troops was believed to be established in and about Hill 27. Then 14th Corps would push west beyond the Cocumbona River on an extended front, with the Americans attacking on both coasts. The men of the Illinois National Guard, 132nd Infantry Regiment, were selected to reduce the enemy-infested Mount Austin Ridge complex. On the slopes of the Mount Austin cone, rising some 1,500 feet skyward, amidst ridges, valleys, rocky terrain, steep hills, and an opaque jungle that locked in the heat, the 132nd would be introduced to warfare. From atop Mount Austin, 6 miles from the Henderson Field perimeter, Japanese soldiers with powerful glasses would be watching all the activity at Henderson Field. The 3rd Battalion, 132nd, was assigned to the task, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Henry H. McCown, who had been the battalion commander since its inception. The 3rd Battalion would clear out the enemy positions on Mount Austin's Hill 27 and the surrounding ridges. McCown had to assess the situation and prepare his battalion to move through a series of hostile Japanese positions in the dense foliage and rugged terrain. The battalion was also assigned an artillery support section. On the 19th, we tried again to gain ground, but were bogged down almost as soon as the advance had started. Colonel Wright hurried forward to make a personal investigation into the cause of the delay and the lack of progress. As he was with the most forward elements of his command, fire from a well-concealed Japanese machine gun trapped and mortally wounded him with a sudden burst. We made several attempts to rescue him, but were forced to withdraw under relentless fire. Finally, late in the afternoon, the regimental S2 formed a patrol and succeeded in reaching Colonel Wright, but he was dead. His body was brought back inside the lines. We were nailed down in our positions by the intense fire. The 57th Engineer Battalion, A and B companies, made supply routes to Mount Austin so we could bring up high explosives to knock out this Japanese position. On Christmas Eve, 1942, 2nd Lieutenant Albert D. Swasina of Company C, 132nd Infantry, led a patrol of 18 soldiers to scrutinize a difficult position 1,000 yards in front of his company. PFC's George J. Drobnak and Orville Elmo Hutchison were the lead scouts, with Sergeant Nicholas Vacola and Perciset Russell K. Pence the point men. PFC Robert G. Hensley, a medic, was part of the team, along with PFC's Anthony A. Martinez, Charles Nolf, and John P. Kissane. The patrol checked out the area and all went well. However, the men made the mistake of returning over the same route. The Japanese were waiting. Vacola and Pence were immediately struck down by machine gun fire. A bullet to the heart killed Hensley a moment later. Lieutenant Swasina was hit in the neck and died within minutes. Drobnak took a bullet in the stomach and then was hit again. He would later die of his wounds. Elmo Hutchison was hit by a grenade fragment and spent a cold night in the brush. In the morning, on hearing the talkative enemy approaching, he managed to crawl away and eventually get back to his own lines. In the survivors' scramble for safety, however, the dead were left behind. They would not be recovered for some 2 months, until February 1943. When Sergeant Vacola's body was found, his dog tags were missing, and Hutchison let Martinez know that they had been taken by the enemy, as he had heard them rattle when they were being removed. A very busy and tired GI at this time was Peter George F. Stanton, a medic attached to the 132nd Infantry who handled caseloads of casualties. Stanton had retired as a lieutenant in the Chicago Fire Department after 22 years of service. He was 55 years old, but had admitted to being only 45, so that, as he acknowledged, he could go overseas with the boys. Like the others, Stanton got more than he bargained for. Arthur L. Holmes was a radio man with Battery H, 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines. Along with Battery G, Battery H supported the 132nd Infantry. That Christmas Eve seemed quiet until the Japanese mortars found Holmes's battery on a ridge. The enemy fire appeared to be coming from a deep ravine to the west, and the 3/10's 75mm pack howitzers fired back with one round every few minutes. A Christmas present, the men decided, for Tojo's soldiers. Amidst it all, however, Holmes's battery did receive a special gift from the cooks of the 132nd. The Cannibal Battalion, a name the GIs gave to the island labourers, transported rations up the long winding hill trail to Battery H's position, turkey sandwiches, plus a can of cranberry sauce for each man. For just a few moments, the war almost was forgotten. Japanese Combat Order #67 described the action that day. The right front of the Ito detachment is facing the enemy at 200 metres. The left front of the Ito detachment pushed back the enemy of about 350 for 5 hours. About 150 made an attack in the morning at 3 places. The Ito detachment sent 2 platoons to the northwest of Miharashi Dai, Hill 54, a Japanese observation post which was strengthened by the reserve unit of the Tamura detachment to shore up that area. On the 24th, 6 men of the Tamura detachment, after making a night attack on the enemy outpost on Sakai Dai, pushed back the enemy. Later, they found 4 bodies of United States soldiers and captured 1 light machine gun, 2 automatic weapons, and 4 rifles. On Christmas Day, Companies E and F of the 132nd Infantry were guided to Hill 27 by 5 Fiji Forces commandos led by Sergeant Frank Williams of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, NZF. The bushwise Fijians were ideal as a reconnaissance team, passing information to the GIs on the disposition of Japanese troops. At 1300 on the 25th, the Fijians and elements of 3 132nds passed through the front lines of the American Division's 182nd Infantry and moved along a ridge route west of the Lunga River. Patrols of the 132nd assaulted Hills 31 and 27 from south of Edson's Bloody Ridge, with 2 rifle companies pressing the attack. Hill 31 afforded an overview of Henderson Field and fighter strips No. 1 and 2, and the plan was to neutralize the enemy position there. What the GIs faced in those rugged foothills were elements of Major Kikuo Hayakawa's 1st Battalion, 228th Infantry, and Major Haruja Nishiyama's 3rd Battalion, 228th, plus segments of the 230th Infantry, and depleted elements of Colonel Akinosuke Oka's 124th Infantry, with the main strength attributed to Major Takeyoshi Inagaki's 2nd Battalion, 228th Infantry. The 124th had fought both battles of Bloody Ridge and lost heavily in each encounter, but Rabaul kept filtering in replacements. Although the enemy was plagued with malaria and half-starved, they were still full of fight, and the 132nd's frontal assault, involving 350 men, was stopped cold. The Japanese holding Hill 27 at Mount Austin remained potent and capable of extracting high casualties. And while the 132nd was getting battered around the slopes of Mount Austin, some major changes occurred at Henderson Field. The airstrip received a small detachment of operators from the Army Airways Communication System, AACS, who were assigned to run the control tower and navigational aids. Air strength continued to improve. The new twin-tailed and fantastic Lockheed Vega P-38 Lightnings were assisting in commanding the Solomon airspace, along with a flight of Martin B-26 Marauders from the 69th Bomb Squadron that had been transferred from New Caledonia. Meanwhile, Fighter Strip No. 1 was upgraded and No. 2 was nearing completion. However, deep in Japanese territory, the 132nd Infantry had suffered a high number of battle casualties, and a feeling of doom began to creep through the ranks. The Illinois Guardsmen began to regroup on the 26th of December, and by the 27th had formed a defence alliance between Hills 32 and 22. While the 3rd Battalion, 132nd Infantry, was getting beaten to death attempting to assault the stronghold, the 2nd Battalion was still performing stevedore duties, unloading vessels at Lunga Roads. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, then moved into position, occupying a hill to the southeast of the 132nd for flank protection. Mac Morris was on Guadalcanal at the time as a Yank reporter. He recorded the following on Saturday, 26 December. "I have just come back from my first trip to the front, or as close to the front as 2 British and 2 American reporters with a Marine driver named Bill could get in a jeep. It wasn't exactly what I expected. We, of course, had been told that in jungle warfare you couldn't see anything at all. We could. We went over the worst roads I have ever travelled in all my life, sincerely, the worst, to a BNCP of the 132nd Infantry, the Men of Illinois, sitting on the edge of the jungle on top of a hill. On the way up, we were passed by, first, a casualty with blonde hair leaning unconscious on the arm of a boy in a jeep, and second, by stretcher-bearers carrying a dead soldier down the hill. The first boy was pale, the second's face was covered, but his pants were covered with blood. He was the first American I've seen killed in action. I don't know what I thought as they brought him by. Not much, except that he was dead because his face was covered. I went on up the hill. There were men who were filthy dirty, and from the look of most of them, tired. They were serious, and I think mad. A patrol of theirs had run point-blank into a machine gun. The CP is on top of a hill, and men were dug in on the slope, a hell of a spot to be in. The jungle thinned a little at the edge, but deeper in it was just a tangle of trees and vines. The advance positions were 300 or 400 yards out in that direction. They pulled back last night to let artillery shell Japanese positions. From the hill is a beautiful view of the sea, with Savo jutting up to the left and Florida lying low to the right, and Tulagi barely visible at its top. As we looked across the terrain westward, we could see the Japanese held ground. We were shelling it, and through an OP scope, we could see shell craters on a forward slope of a hill. I traversed the scope over the ground between us and them, and saw the Marines and infantry troops. I saw somebody standing on top of a ridge, stark naked, bathing. There wasn't much to see except terrain and occasional smoke shells. We apparently were shelling 2 different positions, one at intervals. In the distance along the rim of the island, we could see beached Japanese transports and some landing boats. They were all shot to hell and gone. The beaches were bare. From there we went back over the same awful road, passing artillery batteries firing over our heads at positions we'd seen. We could feel the concussion and hear the shells whistle overhead. On the 26th, while Mac Morris was travelling to and from the front lines, the 3rd Battalion, 182nd Infantry, had set up an ambush in the Matanikau sector, but no Japanese appeared. Later in the day, after the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, had observed a group of Japanese walking a trail, a well-armed patrol was formed, but the roving Japanese vanished. The 3 132nds made another frontal attack on Mount Austin's Hill 27. This time they moved slowly, but were halted by massive machine gun and sniper fire. They managed to put 1 machine gun out of action and killed 9, while losing 5 of their own with 19 wounded. Company C lost 3 men missing and 7 wounded when friendly artillery fire fell in the area. 3 days later, on the 29th of December, the Japanese reported that the Americans were observed to be very active and were increasing their strength in the Mount Austin region after having been pushed back by the small Japanese units. They noted that the Americans had shown a great interest in the Japanese area of Miharashi-dai, Hill 54, in the previous 2 days. The Japanese were aware that the centre of the battle was gradually moving in their direction, They estimated about 400 to 500 of the enemy were opposing the Okabe detachment and some 200 men of the Nishiyama unit. As the 1st and 3rd Battalions, 132nd Infantry, attempted to encircle Mount Austin, they were partially supplied with rations, water and ammunition by what the GIs called the Pigeon Express, the native carriers who were part of the 1st contingent of the Solomon Island Labour Corps. The service company transported supplies by truck from the warehouses as far as Wright Road, the track named for Lieutenant Colonel William C. Wright of the American Division's 132nd Infantry Regiment, who had been killed in action. Colonel Wright was one of a family of 4 brothers in the 132nd. From Wright Road, the Labour Corps workers took over, carrying the materiel up the winding trail, an effort that took hours.